Hello everyone, and welcome back to Retro Legends. When we talk about Sega's exit from the hardware market, the initial reaction is to reduce it all to a single date, a failed console, a sudden decision. But the reality is far more complex. Sega didn't abandon hardware overnight. It happened slowly, piece by piece, through a series of industrial, technological, and strategic choices that tell us much more than just a commercial defeat. This isn't a story of sudden collapse. It's the story of a company that invented the future multiple times and couldn't stay in it. In this video, we'll analyze 10 things you might not know about Sega's exit from the hardware market. Decisions made years earlier, structural errors, brilliant insights that arrived too soon, internal contradictions, and a conclusion that, even today, divides fans and historians alike. Don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell for more journeys into the world of retro gaming. Let's get started. By the late 90s, Sega was no longer a company making centralized decisions. It was a divided structure with two strong poles, Japan and the United States, sharing the same brand but not the same industrial vision. The fracture wasn't ideological but operational. Different goals, different market interpretations, and, most importantly, decision-making chains that rarely converged. The Japanese division continued to think in terms of product, engineering, and the brand's historical identity. The American division, on the other hand, looked at the Western market, aggressive communication, positioning, and the need to compete directly with Sony on image and mainstream appeal. These two strategies were not harmonized. They proceeded in parallel, often ignoring each other. The result was not a virtuous synthesis, but a disorderly overlap. With the Dreamcast, this distance becomes structural. Decisions on hardware, launch, pricing, and marketing do not follow a single line. In some territories, the console is presented as a revolutionary system, a generation ahead. In others, as an aggressive, almost defensive, relaunch product. Even the software support reflects this ambiguity. Titles designed to enhance arcade identity coexist with games crafted to chase Western trends, lacking a clear editorial direction. The problem is not the quality of individual decisions, but the absence of a central authority to coordinate them. Limited resources are scattered in disconnected initiatives, duplicated campaigns, and strategies that cancel each other out. In an increasingly competitive hardware market, where timing and consistency are crucial, this disunity weighs as much as a technical flaw. When a platform fails despite a good product, the signal is clear. The issue isn't what's built, but how the company building it is managed. From a technological standpoint, the Dreamcast is the result of clear and pragmatic design. Its architecture was conceived to reduce the complexity typical of consoles of that era. The CPU and GPU work in a predictable way, memory access is linear, and development is simpler compared to competing systems. This results in faster production times, faithful arcade conversions, and immediate, clean graphics output, often superior for its time. Choices like the built-in modem and the focus on online gaming show a forward-thinking vision, structured, not experimental. The critical point is that this technical solidity arrived in a market where the center of gravity had already shifted. By the late 90s, competition was no longer just about hardware specifications or ease of development. What mattered was the ability to sustain the platform long-term. Coordinated global marketing, relationships with major publishers, contractual power over production costs, and widespread presence in key territories. The Dreamcast entered the scene as an excellent machine, but without an industrial network capable of amplifying its value. Sega thus found itself in an asymmetrical position. It had to convince developers and consumers with product quality, while competitors could do so with promises of continuity, strong brands, and massive investments. Every Dreamcast success required a disproportionate effort. Every mistake weighed double. The console didn't lack identity, but it lacked strategic protection. In this context, hardware ceased to be the decisive factor. Even a well-designed platform needs time, resources, and trust to establish itself. Dreamcast had the potential, but not the favorable environment. And when the war shifted from engineers to balance sheets, from specifications to agreements, a good machine alone was no longer enough. The GD-ROM was born as a rational choice. It offered more space than traditional CDs, kept production costs relatively low, and allowed Sega to avoid royalties and the technological dependencies typical of standardized optical formats. On paper, it was a clever compromise, capacious enough for the market of its time, economical enough to entice publishers, and most importantly, proprietary, thus theoretically more controllable. The problem is that control doesn't last long. The Dreamcast's architecture, combined with the nature of the GD-ROM, proves to be more permeable than expected. In a surprisingly short time, piracy becomes widespread, accessible, almost trivial for the average user. This is not a niche of tech-savvy enthusiasts, but a mass phenomenon that spreads widely, especially in markets already sensitive to price. This radically changes the perception of the platform. For third-party publishers, the issue is not moral or ideological, but purely economic. Investing in Dreamcast means exposing oneself to a high risk of not recouping costs, regardless of product quality. Even a well-received game can sell less than expected, not due to lack of public interest, but due to uncontrolled distribution of pirated copies. The result is a progressive disengagement. Fewer approved projects, less budget allocated, less confidence in the medium term. At this point, a vicious circle that is difficult to break is triggered. The reduction in software support weakens the console's appeal, which in turn sells less hardware. Lower sales make developing new titles even less convenient, and the system loses momentum precisely when it needs continuity and critical mass. It's not a sudden collapse, but a constant erosion. For a platform that could not count on unlimited financial reserves or pre-existing market dominance, the loss of control over software is more than a technical problem. It's a structural fracture. The GD-ROM, a solution designed to protect the system, ends up accelerating its weakening. And in an industry where software is the true engine of survival, this type of vulnerability doesn't offer second chances. One of the key elements to understand the Dreamcast's fate is to look not at what it was, but what it came after. Sega didn't arrive at the dawn of the sixth generation as a neutral company, ready to play a new game. It arrived with a heavy legacy, made of choices layered over time that progressively consumed capital, trust, and strategic coherence. Throughout the 90s, Sega pushed its audience towards a logic of continuous and often unclear upgrades. Mega Drive, Mega CD, 32X, Saturn. Each step required a new investment from users and commercial partners, rarely accompanied by a solid and reassuring roadmap. Many accessories were quickly abandoned. Several platforms lost support before reaching commercial maturity, and the message that filtered through was dangerous. Buying Sega meant exposing oneself to uncertainty. This directly impacts credibility. Retailers became more cautious, consumers more wary, and third-party publishers less inclined to commit long-term. Even when the product is good, the market's memory doesn't just reset. Every new launch is filtered through past experiences, and in Sega's case, those experiences include hardware quickly shelved and promises not fully kept. The Dreamcast thus emerged in an asymmetrical position. It wasn't just a new console to sell, but a complete litmus test. It had to convince those who had been burned, win back those who had strayed, and demonstrate stability in a sector that, in the meantime, had become much more aggressive and centralized. Unlike its competitors, Sega couldn't afford a slow start, nor a period of adjustment. Every quarter counted, every mistake weighed double. This changed the very nature of the project. The Dreamcast wasn't designed for gradual growth. It was born under pressure, loaded with expectations that went beyond the product itself. It didn't just have to work, it had to perform immediately. It didn't just have to be liked, it had to overturn a consolidated negative perception. Under these conditions, even a minor stumble became critical. And this is where the central point emerges. The problem isn't that Sega made mistakes with the Dreamcast. It's that it arrived at the Dreamcast with no room for maneuver left. A financially and strategically weakened company has no space to learn from its errors. And in an industry where hardware is a high-risk gamble, starting without a safety net means the latest launch can't just be good. It has to be perfect. The announcement of PlayStation 2 shouldn't be seen as a mere market reaction to a new product, but as a radical shift in expectations. Sony isn't just presenting a console that follows the original PlayStation, it's building a long-term narrative where the hardware becomes the center of a broader home entertainment ecosystem. The message is clear and powerful. PlayStation 2 won't just be for gaming, but for stepping into the future. The DVD player is the key element in this perception. At a historical moment when DVD was rapidly replacing VHS and Laserdisc, Sony managed to link the purchase of the console to a transversal need, not exclusively gaming-related. The PS2 was thus perceived as a rational, almost inevitable investment, independent of its initial game catalog. The Dreamcast, on the other hand, remained tied to the idea of a gaming machine, even if more advanced in many aspects. This changes the behavior of the audience. Demand is no longer tied to immediate supply, but to future value. Many consumers start postponing their purchase, not because the Dreamcast lacks titles or quality, but because the promise of the PlayStation 2 creates a strategic weight. Buying now becomes a temporary choice. Waiting becomes the smart move. In a sector where hardware life cycles are long, this dynamic is truly devastating. Publishers react accordingly. Knowing that PlayStation 2 will become the next standard, many studios begin reallocating resources, reducing support for Dreamcast, or treating it as a transitional platform. It's not a lack of faith in the console, but an industrial calculation. Investing in the near future guarantees a larger installed base and greater visibility in the medium term. The paradox is that the Dreamcast is already technologically ahead of the previous generation. It offers built-in online features, fast loading times, a modern graphics pipeline. But the market doesn't reward what's already ready. It rewards what promises to last. The moment Sony manages to monopolize the idea of the future, the Dreamcast loses its symbolic advantage even before it loses its commercial one. From that point on, Sega is no longer fighting against a competing console, but against a collective expectation. And against expectations, no matter how good the hardware is, it's not enough. These titles represent the best of Sega's creative vision, but also the structural limit of the Dreamcast as a commercial platform. Shenmue, Jet Set Radio, Sonic Adventure, and Crazy Taxi are not just good games. They are projects that experiment with languages, aesthetics, and mechanics that would only become common years later. Narrative open world, radical artistic direction, hyperkinetic arcade physics, incredibly strong sound identities. The Dreamcast is, in essence, an open-air creative laboratory. The problem is that this strength doesn't translate into mass appeal. When hardware is perceived as transitory, even the most ambitious games lose their function as a system driver. They don't push console sales. Instead, they become experiences to revisit, not reasons to buy in. The public admires, but postpones. They appreciate, but don't commit. It's a psychological dynamic even before it's a commercial one. There's also an industrial aspect. These titles are often expensive, risky, and highly authorial. Shenmue, in particular, required huge sales to break even. Jet Set Radio divided audiences with an uncompromising style. Sonic Adventure brought the brand into 3D with innovative but not universally accessible results. These are games that build reputation, not an installed base. The result is a silent but decisive transformation. The Dreamcast became a console loved more than it was bought. Its games didn't define an era when they were released. They defined it later, in retrospect. They became cult classics because they didn't have time to be mainstream. And here lies the crucial difference. Mass appeal generates continuity, while a cult generates memory. Sega wins on the idea front, but loses on permanence. And in a hardware market, being remembered isn't enough if you can't endure. The relationship between Sega and Microsoft regarding the Dreamcast is often portrayed as a strategic alliance, but in reality, it was an asymmetric relationship. Microsoft provided concrete tools, support for Windows CE, collaboration on online infrastructure, and dialogue with some Western publishers. It was real help, but it wasn't an existential investment. For Microsoft, the Dreamcast wasn't a goal, it was a case study. Through Sega, Microsoft observed from the inside what it meant to launch a modern console, the costs of hardware, the importance of first-party software, the difficulties of large-scale online gaming, the relationship with developers, and, above all, the fragility of an ecosystem without unlimited financial resources. The Dreamcast proved that technology alone is not enough. Capital, continuity, and a long-term strategy are needed. The lessons learned were not applied to save Sega, but to build something autonomous. When Xbox officially enters the market, the picture becomes definitive. Microsoft is no longer an external partner, it's a direct competitor with incomparably superior resources and a vision already refined by observing others' failures. At that point, for Sega, the competitive space doesn't just shrink, it vanishes. The Dreamcast had anticipated many ideas of the modern era, but lacked the structure to sustain them. Microsoft, however, did. The support for the Dreamcast, in hindsight, thus appears as the final sign of transition, the moment Sega stopped being a protagonist of future hardware, and, unknowingly, became a source of learning for those who would dominate that future. When this becomes clear, the decision to exit the market is no longer a sudden surrender, but the acknowledgement of a game already over. Sega's decision to exit the hardware market doesn't come out of the blue. It's not an impulsive act, not a gut reaction, and certainly not an emotional surrender. It's something that was prepared over time, almost in silence. After difficult years and the last gamble represented by the Dreamcast, it becomes clear within Sega that the problem isn't just a console that didn't do well. The problem is the entire industrial model, which is no longer sustainable. Making hardware at that point meant incurring enormous costs. Production, global distribution, aggressive marketing, continuous support. And Sega arrives at that moment already tired, marked by wrong choices, internal divisions, and resources that are no longer what they once were. So the company stops. It analyzes, it restructures, it cuts where it needs to cut, merges teams, redesigns hierarchies, changes leadership, not out of pride, but for survival. And this is where the most important transition happens. Sega realizes that continuing to compete on the hardware front against giants like Sony and Nintendo is no longer a sustainable battle. Not because of a lack of talent, but because the industrial conditions are no longer there. The choice that follows is cold, clear, painful. Sega decides to stop producing consoles, but it doesn't decide to stop existing. On the contrary, at that moment the company finally understands its true value. Not the machines, but the content, the worlds it creates, the characters that remain in our memories, the ideas, the style, the identity. Sega doesn't abandon video games. It only abandons hardware to go back to doing what it has always known best, creating experiences on any platform. It's a surrender, yes, but it's also the only choice that allows Sega to move forward. And here is where the final paradox reveals itself. The moment Sega leaves the hardware market, it saves itself. It gets rid of the greatest burden it carried, the need to support a proprietary, expensive, and fragile ecosystem that drained resources and limited every choice. Without a console to defend, Sega changes its perspective. Decisions become faster, investments more targeted, risks more manageable. Creativity no longer has to adapt to a machine that needs to be sold, but can focus on what truly matters: the games. Becoming a publisher means exactly this: protecting its own IPs, bringing them everywhere, letting them grow without artificial constraints. It means being able to experiment, even make mistakes, without every project having to bear the entire weight of the company. Sega is no longer at the center of hardware, it's true. But it never leaves the heart of video game culture. Sonic continues to exist and reinvent itself. Yakuza finds its audience and builds a strong identity. Persona becomes a global phenomenon. Total War establishes itself as one of the most solid strategic series ever. All of this is possible because, at a certain point, Sega chose to stop. And by stopping, it found a way to move forward. Sega's exit from the hardware market isn't a defeat. It's a metamorphosis. It's the end of an era where consoles were personal visions, pure risks, ideas pushed to their limits. But it's also the beginning of a new Sega, perhaps more fragile, but still capable of leaving its mark. And now the question is inevitable. Could Sega have made it if it had held on a little longer? Or was its destiny already written years before? Let's discuss it in the comments. And with that, our journey into the past comes to an end. How many of these curiosities did you already know? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell for more journeys into the world of retro gaming. Thanks for watching Retro Legends, and we'll see you in the next video. Stay retro, stay legends.